Whenever I cover initial aviation accidents, I like to assume that the pilots didn't do anything stupid. It appears in the case of Voepass Flight 2283, I may have made a mistake. I'm Stan. Let's get into it. The Voepass ATR-72 airliner crashed in early August following a spectacular flat spin that was captured in cell phone footage by witnesses on the ground. Initial reports noted a forecast of severe icing in the region, leading many, myself included, to conclude that one of the contributing factors of the accident was going to be in-flight icing. The ATR-72 has a bit of a history with icing. In the 90s, the fleet was briefly prohibited from flying in icing conditions following the crash of an American Eagle ATR outside of Chicago. The manufacturer scrambled to improve the deice boots installed on the aircraft, and the FAA, in conjunction with ATR, ran a series of tests utilizing an Air Force tanker spraying frozen contaminants onto the airframe to recertify the fleet for winter operations. Even with the recertification, American Eagle eventually banished all of their remaining ATRs to island hopping out of a base in Puerto Rico. Now, there are a few interesting notes included in the preliminary report published by SNIPA. I'm not going to try to pronounce what that stands for, but it's the Brazilian equivalent of the NTSB. The investigations carried out do not seek to establish guilt or liability. If used in judicial or police proceedings, this may hinder justice and generate an adverse effect on the prevention of aircraft accidents by inhibiting voluntary participation. What this means is that if you are a pilot involved in an accident in South America, they're liable to throw you in jail if you display what they consider to be criminal negligence. If these pilots had survived this accident, it's altogether possible they'd be in jail right now. Even up here in the States, they could have ended up in some trouble. They made some intentional decisions that resulted in the crash. In essence, their negligence resulted in the death of all 62 occupants. The aircraft departed at 14:58 UTC. 14 minutes later, they were in icing conditions. The propeller anti-ice was turned on. Here you'll notice the term anti-icing. This refers to a device that prevents the accumulation of ice. The other form of ice protection is de-icing, which removes ice that has already accumulated. This is principally in the form of de-ice boots on the ATR-72. Anti-ice, such as for propellers, should be turned on prior to accumulating ice, which is what the crew did here. 2 minutes after the prop ice was turned on, the crew alerting system aboard the aircraft indicated an accumulation of ice. Now, there's an ice detector aboard the ATR, which is just a probe that vibrates. When ice accumulates on the probe, it changes the frequency of that vibration, and that generates an ice alert. Immediately after the alert, airframe de-icing was turned on. This refers to the inflatable boots on the wings and on the tail. When this system is turned on, the boots inflate, removing ice from the leading edges of the aircraft. About a half a minute after the airframe de-ice system was turned on, the crew was alerted to a fault. They turned the airframe de-ice off a few seconds later. Now, it's important to understand a couple of things here. The first is, when a pilot receives an alert associated with the abnormal functioning of a piece of equipment, they're required to accomplish the abnormal procedure associated with the failure. All modern aircraft have emergency abnormal checklists. Generally, the document that these are published in are hundreds of pages long. The pilots are supposed to find the associated checklist and read through it to accomplish any required items. Now, the crew turned off the airframe de-ice 7 seconds after the fault message alerted. They didn't have enough time to read the associated abnormal checklist by this point. It doesn't mean that what they did was wrong. The second item on the de-ice airframe fault checklist is to turn the de-ice system off, but there are other items on that checklist as well, principally the requirement to exit icing conditions, which is the first item. Investigators only released portions of the cockpit voice recorder transcript. We'll have to wait to the final report to see if they ever ran the checklist or if they simply switched the system off and then moved on. Given the fact that investigators did not comment on it, I think the crew probably failed to run the full checklist. Remarkably, they remained in icing conditions at 17,000 feet for the next hour. The ice detector was triggered 5 additional times over this period. In the 3 instances following the initial failure, the crew ignored the alert. Following the 5th system alert for airframe de-icing, the crew attempted to turn the system on once again. Given everything that happened following this, it appears that the aircraft was accumulating a substantial amount of ice. The crew indicated to approach controllers that it was, and I quote here, an optimal time for them to descend. The controller advised the crew that they needed to maintain 17,000 feet due to crossing traffic. The crew here likely wanted to descend because of the ice accumulation, but didn't want to admit that they had an equipment malfunction. If they had declared pon or a mayday, they would have gotten the descent and we wouldn't be here talking about them. Within 30 seconds of the ATC communication, the first officer commented on how much ice the aircraft was accumulating. 5 seconds after this, for the third time following the initial failure, the crew turned on the failed airframe de-icing. Following this, ATC informed the crew that they would receive a descent clearance in 2 minutes. The failure message for airframe de-icing the previous 2 times had triggered 70 seconds after the system had been turned on. In this case, the aircraft wouldn't survive that long. They entered the fatal spin 52 seconds after their final attempt to activate the de-icing system. Now, before we move on, there are several things that we need to unpack here. The first is that Voepass Airlines operates 2 different variants of the ATR-72, the older Dash 500 and the newer Dash 600 variants. The Dash 500 models come equipped with traditional steam gauges. These are predominantly round gauges that are mechanically operated. The Dash 600s utilize electronic displays. Reducing workload for the flight crew, the abnormal procedures for the Dash 600s reside in the electronic display system and will automatically populate when a failure enunciates. For the 500s, the crews would be required to refer to the abnormal procedure in the appropriate document, which would either be a physical book or a representative one in their iPad. If there was a failure of the crew to run the procedure, this difference might explain it. Odds are, if they had been in the newer Dash 600, the procedure would have automatically populated on the middle screen, and the first item, in yellow to indicate its importance, would have been icing conditions, leave and avoid. The second thing important to note is that both crew members appeared to communicate via the hint and hope method. I can't really overstate this enough. That's a horrible form of communication in aviation which should be avoided at all costs. It's also something that we see, unfortunately, regularly in airline accidents. The crew hinted to ATC that they wanted to descend instead of articulating that they were an emergency aircraft, which they definitely were, and telling ATC that they were going to descend. ATC would have vectored the crossing traffic below them out of their way. Similarly, the first officer commented, somewhat benignly, that they were accumulating a lot of ice. He was hinting to the captain that they should be doing something about it. Again, the more direct communication, "we need to descend now," would have been more appropriate. This leads to an obvious conclusion. The crew didn't appreciate how dangerous ice can be. This is extraordinary given the ATR's muddled history with icing accidents. The preliminary report specifically notes that the Voepass training program included instruction on operations in icing conditions. It's difficult to say the degree to which this was emphasized to pilots. You can understand, around the equator, why pilots might underestimate the risk of operating in icing conditions. In warm climates, if you accumulate a bit of ice at altitude, it'll melt off before you land. But what happened in this case was excessive ice accumulation, which resulted in significant drag. This drag produced a rapid deterioration of airspeed. Compounding this is the fact that ice accumulation degrades the wing's ability to produce lift. This increases the minimum speed at which an aircraft will lose control. We'll drop back into the preliminary report here. At 16:18, about 2.5 minutes prior to the loss of control, the crew received the alert cruise speed low. This was generated by the Aircraft Performance Monitoring System, the APM. This is a clever little system. It uses predicted aircraft performance to determine the current drag present on the airframe. The crew twists a knob to indicate the rough weight of the aircraft, and the system uses a combination of weight, air data, and power setting to predict the stable cruise speed for the aircraft. If the actual cruise speed is slower than this prediction by more than 10%, you get the cruise speed low message. The pilot response is to monitor icing conditions and cruise speed. Monitor icing conditions because the degradation could be due to the drag generated by ice accumulation. That's what the system is there for. The second level, degraded performance, is enunciated when the speed has degraded by more than 22%. The first item, maintain icing bug plus 10 knots. Icing bug is an airspeed that's based on aircraft weight. The crew moves a physical bug on the airspeed indicator to indicate what that speed is. In this case, it was 165 knots. You add 10 to that for degraded performance, and the minimum airspeed is 175 knots. There's an important note associated with this, which encourages the crew to instead maintain icing bug plus 30 knots, which would have been 195 knots. This is a reference to the minimum airspeed for flight in severe icing conditions. Effectively, the manufacturer is saying here that with degraded performance, the crew might effectively be in severe icing conditions, whether they recognize it or not. In this case, based on available performance data, the crew was experiencing severe ice. The degradation in airspeed was rapid, and the stall occurred at 169 knots. The crew received this message 5 seconds after ATC told them that they needed to maintain 17,000 feet for crossing traffic. The final alert, increased airspeed, occurs below 170 knots when the degraded performance message is active. In this case, it occurred simultaneously with the stall. It appears that the crew was able to fight for control in the stall condition for a handful of seconds before the spin developed. The proper response for a spin recovery is maximum power and pitch down. One last thing to note, the aircraft was operating with a deferred item, which is an operative piece of equipment. The pneumatic air conditioning kit, otherwise referred to as PAC, pressurizes and conditions the cabin air. Most pressurized aircraft, and all airliners, are equipped with 2 PACs. The number 1 PAC was inoperative for this flight. That PAC is powered by the number 1 engine, which means it reduces the thrust available for that engine when it's operating. The number 2 PAC is powered by the right engine. So in this particular case, the left engine would be capable of delivering more torque to the propeller than the right engine due to the left PAC being turned off for the flight. This might go some distance in explaining how the spin developed. The left engine producing more torque than the right. The initial spin was clockwise, which would have been consistent with this, but when the flat spin itself developed, it turned in the opposite direction. This was most likely because of an aggressive recovery effort for the clockwise spin, which was generating anti-clockwise rotation. At that point, with the heavy wing-mounted engines acting as lever arms, the rotation would have been uncontrollable. The result here is that this aircraft shouldn't have crashed. It wasn't an airframe issue. It wasn't even an icing issue, although it wound up being a contributing factor. It was the failure of the flight crew to follow published procedures when they first encountered the airframe deice error message. They also failed to follow published guidance when they received the cruise speed low message. Now you have to understand that this message was, in line operations, probably a bit of a nuisance. A 10% degradation in airspeed could be caused by a mountain wave or a decreasing headwind. The crew was probably used to seeing this message in conditions where ice was obviously not a factor. In this case, though, ice was obviously a factor. And not long after receiving this alert, they also failed to respond to the more serious, degraded airspeed message. Now, to be fair to them, they were task saturated when this transpired. The first officer was communicating with company personnel about the arrival at the airport. At the same time, the captain was briefing the passengers over the intercom. Air traffic control was keeping them high and giving them a vector towards the airport. But none of this relieves their responsibility to follow the checklists. This is the sort of one, as a professional pilot, that I hate. Nobody should have died here. It didn't require extraordinary piloting skills, just common judgment and adherence to standard operating principles. In the air, in the ice, it's not the time to get cute. It's the time to go fast, and if you can't manage that in level flight, you have to descend. And this isn't something that you ask for. It's something that you tell ATC that you're doing, prefixed by Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Some time ago, I wrote an article for Twin and Turbine magazine about flight and icing conditions. I addressed a proper response for equipment failure in that article. I ended the article with one of my all-time favorite conclusions. Be brave, but be fast. I'm dropping a link to the article at the end of this video for those who are interested. I'm also including a link for the video recreation I based that article on. It's an interesting story about the disappearance of 2 congressmen over Alaska in the 70s. In the end, with Voepass, it doesn't do any good to moralize against the pilots who lost their lives as well. If you despise them in your heart, you're not going to learn the lesson. Sometimes the things that'll kill you seem like a trifle. In aviation, though, those seeming trifles are defended by operating practices. Now, I'm going to tell you something up front. You're not smart enough to survive on your own. You've got to take the pain and effort to first know what you're doing and then apply it, even when it's an inconvenience. A little bit of discipline goes a long way towards a safe flight. God bless the passengers. God bless the pilots who screwed it up. Until next time, stay safe.